Hello everyone and welcome back to the Christian Perspectives 2004 YouTube channel. And in today's video we are going to be going over a kind of highly debated topic. It's not really highly debated anymore in the modern day, but it is highly debated amongst scholars outside of the Christian and Judaistic faiths. So today we are going to be discussing, is John the Baptist Elijah or just in the spirit of Elijah? This was actually a highly debated topic about reincarnation in general in the first and early second century church. And in this video, we are going to be making arguments for both, that John the Baptist is Elijah, along with making arguments that he is not Elijah. And then we will ultimately be going through a lot of scripture in this video and analyzing words, particularly the words that Jesus said about the matter, and ultimately come to a conclusion. So here are the arguments for John the Baptist being Elijah. In Malachi 4 verse 5, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." So that is a messianic prophecy in the book of Malachi that states that Elijah the prophet is coming before the Lord to pave the way for the Lord. And then in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 11 verse 14, Jesus says, "And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come." And then goes on to say in Matthew 17 verses 10 through 13, "Elijah has already come." Then the disciples knew he was speaking of John the Baptist. So, at surface level, it does appear that John the Baptist and Elijah are the same spirit, as John fulfills the prophecy of Elijah, paving the way for the coming of the Lord. And this is seemingly at surface value supported by Jesus himself when he says Elijah has already come, and how the disciples knew he was talking of John the Baptist. Plus, Elijah never died and was taken up to heaven. In 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 11, "Suddenly a chariot of fire appeared, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven." Therefore, you can make the argument, if you do believe that Elijah and John the Baptist are the same spirit, you can make the argument, since Elijah never died, that God's law that we see in the book of Hebrews that says one life and then judgment is not violated. So at surface value, it does seem that this theory of John the Baptist and Elijah, being the same person and reincarnation is biblical. But we're now going to be getting into the argument against this theory. Arguments against John being Elijah. This view clearly states that Jesus' words were symbolic and not literal. A good example of Jesus speaking symbolic and not literally is when Jesus spoke of tearing down the temple and raising a new one in 3 days. The Pharisees thought he was talking of the literal temple, but he was actually talking about his body, foreshadowing his death and resurrection. And it showcases how Jesus often said things in a symbolic or in a parable, and not always in a literal sense. And here is some more scriptural evidence in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 17. When speaking of John the Baptist, he will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. And then in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 21, John specifically says, I am not Elijah. And then we flip back to the Old Testament, 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 15. After Elijah ascends into heaven, Elisha asked the Lord to have the spirit of Elijah, not to become Elijah, but to have the spirit and power and strength of the prophet Elijah. And the Lord grants this request. So in this argument, the phrase spirit and power are symbolic, not literal. It's a prophetic calling. The first century church, who knew John and knew Jesus, denied that John was Elijah, and rather made it clear that John came in the spirit and power of Elijah to fulfill the prophecy. So, seeing how the first century church knew the apostles and was led by the apostles, and how the apostles knew Jesus and knew little bits of John, clearly they knew, that John was not Elijah, because they themselves said so. And it's even written in the Gospels that John came in the spirit and power of Elijah. He did not become Elijah. He came in the spirit and power of Elijah to fulfill the messianic prophecy. And another key point to make, reincarnation is not biblical in either Christianity or Judaism. So regardless how you spin it, regardless which faith you subscribe to, reincarnation is not biblical in either the Torah or the New Testament. So clearly, Jesus' words in the Gospel of Matthew are often misinterpreted by people who try to blend Jesus in with another faith like Buddhism or Hinduism. But instead, if you actually study the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus, you will see Jesus was speaking in a symbolic way, not a literal way. So in conclusion, now that we've gone over both arguments, we looked at the surface level, we dug deeper and dug and dug and dug. In conclusion, is John the Baptist Elijah reincarnated? No, he is not. John, like Elisha, was granted the spirit and power of Elijah, but does not literally become Elijah. And these points are driven home when the first century church made it clear that Jesus, nor John, nor the apostles ever taught anything about reincarnation. And this whole idea of John the Baptist being Elijah, to my understanding, does not even originally come from Christian sources, but comes from sources outside of the Christian and Judaistic faiths. And as I mentioned earlier, the first time that I ever heard of this theory was from my philosophy professor, who tried to blend Christianity and Buddhism together, which I will do a separate video on why those two faiths cannot both be true, and ultimately why Jesus is more reliable than Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. But that's a video for another day. But the whole debate on is John the Baptist Elijah does not originate from the apostles. It does not originate from the church. And you have to study the Gospels, study the words and the figure of speeches Jesus would speak in, and then you'll clearly see that Jesus was making it clear that, like Elisha, John the Baptist had the spirit and power of Elijah, but he was not literally Elijah. So, with that being said, is John the Baptist Elijah, or is he just in the spirit of Elijah? John the Baptist is just in the spirit of Elijah. They are two totally, completely different souls. So, that's that, really. There's no other way of putting it. So, I thank you all for watching this video, and God bless you all, and have an amazing day.